solving puzzles and adventures. And I think typography or typeface design is the same thing for me, as trying to understand a culture and history is important to design a typeface.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into Nodes of Design. To help support our mission spread knowledge, we have a very special guest on today's episode. Let's welcome Joe Stitzlein. Joe is a creative director and a typeface designer. He had worked with Steve Jobs to define Apple's photography and packaging standards, and with Michelle Obama to launch a Let's Move program for healthy schools. He also designed the iconic identities for Netflix, Nike, Dwell Magazine, and Mac OS X. Along with these, he also built a global design studio at Google and had designed typefaces in major writing systems around the world, created campaigns that made Nike Free the World the best-selling shoe. In this episode, Joe had shared wonderful insights on typography, and we discussed on what's the major difference between a typeface and a font and how to choose a perfect typeface from millions of available choices. The later part, we discussed on what are the best practices for choosing a font pair, and Joe had shared us with some wonderful examples on different popular font pairs that one can use. In the end, we spoke on how to craft typography for accessibility, and we ended the show by Joe's words of advice for young designers to get into typography and build attractive portfolios. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and on every Friday we release new episodes with different creative leaders from around the world to help you better understand different concepts related to design. So don't forget to tune in into Notes of Design every Friday. With that being said, happy designing everyone. Hi Joe, welcome to Nodes of Design. It's a pleasure hosting you today on our show.
Thank you very much, Tej. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you, Joe. So how's your day going?
It just started here. It's about 8:30 in California, 8:30 a.m. So we just got the kids up and ready to do their schoolwork because they're in remote school, of course, like much of the United States. But just getting started and excited to talk with you.
That's great, Joe. So if you could give a brief about yourself to our audience out there.
Sure. My name is Joe Stitzlein. I've been a creative director and designer, graphic designer, and type designer for about 25 years. I grew up in the Midwest, and I've worked for many agencies and companies doing design, from Pentagram to SY Partners, Nike. I worked at Landor, and then my last real job was at Google, and I've owned my own studio, which I run with my wife. She's also a designer. We've been running it for about 5 years now, and I've done a wide variety of work, which I enjoy. Everything from designing typefaces to designing logos like the Netflix logo, and designing campaigns at Nike for many footwear launches, as well as the Olympic trials. And then, we've been focusing a lot in the last 5 years on motion-first identities that are code-based, because a lot of what we do is very digital, of course. And so we work with a lot of engineers and creative technologists to bring our design ideas to life, which is always fun, and it's always changing, which just keeps it engaging and interesting.
That's wonderful, Joe. So what was your journey into design, and how did you start? And what are your tips to the beginners on how to start?
Oh, well, that's a great question. I was in high school. I really enjoyed art class and painting. I was always an okay student. I really enjoyed reading, but I wasn't really engaged with academia until I took an art class. And, I was kind of saved by an art teacher, Mrs. Crockett. And she taught me, to love painting and love drawing. And that's when I really started becoming engaged more as a student in general. And from high school, the local university where I grew up in the Midwest, in a town called Cincinnati, happened to have a world-class design program, but it was just kind of a community school, lucky for me. And I went there and happened to fall into a world-class graphic design program. I didn't even know what graphic design necessarily was. And back in the 90s, graphic design wasn't as, widely known like it is now. We didn't have the web. We didn't have, everybody knows what graphic design or design is, and everyone knows what marketing is now. But back then it was more cutting edge. and there weren't that many designers. And so I didn't know much about it going into it. And, I really loved the craft. I loved the research involved. I loved that it had some science aspects from color theory, to ideas around legibility. Process was involved. So I loved all of that. And that's why I wasn't good as a fine artist, because I didn't like it being too wide open. I like constraints, and I like working with constraints, and I like collaborating with others. So that's why I've always enjoyed working with clients and working with a brief and trying to communicate an idea. So I think I just kind of fell into design. And then, went from college. I did internships in college in New York and San Francisco, and did an internship at Pentagram, did an internship at Landor in San Francisco, and really fell in love with the West Coast in the United States, which at the time was very forward thinking in terms of design, very progressive. And after I graduated from school, I didn't have a job, but I got a one-way train ticket and a couple of portfolios, and went out and looked for a job. And, I've been out here ever since, for 25 years. So just kind of got lucky and fell into it.
That's a wonderful journey, Joe. So if you could share with us the insights behind your project on Netflix logo and Nike and your Google experience that you had.
Sure. Well, so there's a lot of different projects that I think I've really been lucky to be involved with and been at the right time in the right place. Netflix at the time, I think it was around 99, 2000. They were around. They weren't a startup exactly, but they were, they were mailing all those red envelopes all over the world, all over the country. I believe they were just the United States at the time. And they still do mail DVDs, by the way. But at the time they came to us. I was at an agency called CKS at the time. They came to us, looking for a more cohesive identity, and we created more of a cinematic identity for them. So I did the black and white logo with the black outline that evoked marquees on cinemas. I designed that for them and really just tried to bring the idea of cinema to life. And at the time, they talked about their ideas for the future, which I was pretty skeptical about. They were very honest about wanting to stream movies, which in the year 2000 was seen as being more science fiction because, the bandwidth didn't exist in much of the world to stream, even a 480p movie, much less, 1080p or now 4K. They didn't have 4K back then, but to think about the throughput necessary for them to talk about that, I was pretty skeptical that they would ever get to that point. But, it wasn't an accident that they named themselves Netflix and not DVDs by mail, right? So they always had that in mind. And I think what that taught me was I really enjoy working with clients on their future roadmap and understanding their plans for the future and designing for the future, not today. And that's where I've been lucky to work with brands like Netflix and Nike and Google that are always thinking about the next 10, 20 years, not just the next 3 months. And so how do we design a brand roadmap for that future, not just a brand that represents what they are today? Because we do try to design things that are timeless. That's one thing I was taught as a graphic designer, because I was taught in more of a Swiss style, more clean, more timeless. And I really believe in creating long-term solutions for our clients. Now, what was interesting about Nike was that, we were taught to, design for emotion. We were taught to get a poster on a kid's bedroom wall or in a kid's locker, or make a T-shirt. That's what we aspire to do, is to create things that make people feel something, which in some ways is easier with sport than it is with a Netflix or working with Apple. Although people certainly have emotional connections to those brands too. But with sport, whether it's Adidas or Nike or Puma or any of the other sport brands, it's more expected within those design cultures. So I really enjoyed, taking my kind of understanding about systems and Swiss training, and then learning at Nike how to turn that into emotional design around campaigns and footwear communications. So I learned a lot and had a lot of fun creating events around marathons. One of the projects that I was proud to work on was the Nike Free, which is a shoe that bent like your foot. And at the time, everybody was into, and this is the mid 2010s, everybody was into these natural shoes that kind of moved with your foot. And it became the world's best-selling shoe, not just in sport, but the best-selling shoe, period. And so I was happy to be a small part of that success for Nike. And I learned a lot along the way. The other thing were events we worked on, where I learned how to create retail environments. I had marathons with Olympic trials. We did a project called Camp Victory in Oregon, where we brought the Nike Plus community, which is a digital community, into the real world. And we kind of gamified it with these large screens where runners can run against each other and see their scoreboard in real time with their speed in real time. So that was a lot of fun to think about. How do we take digital experiences and make them analog? How do you create retail campaigns that really excite runners and other athletes? So that was a really wonderful time in my career as well.
Thank you so much, Joe. And we've been getting a lot of questions from our listeners on your experience working with Steve Jobs and Michelle Obama. If you could share some light on that as well.
Yeah, I have a lot of Steve Jobs stories. Well, when I was at CKS working on Netflix, I was also, my main job, actually Netflix was just a small thing I worked on. I designed that logo type for maybe a day, but my main job was being an art director for Apple. Now they have a really large in-house department at Apple, but back then, much of the work was done by CKS, by an agency, CKS. And so I was freelance. And so it was late 90s. We were helping launch the Titanium PowerBook and the PowerMac Cube. And I don't know if you've ever seen that. Yeah, it wasn't a popular product. It was a cube. It was about this big, maybe, 10 inches square. And, it pulled out with a handle so you could put more RAM in it. It was a pretty big failure for them, but it was a really beautiful product. And I art directed the photography for that, the Titanium PowerBook. I believe I worked on one of the CRT iMacs, although I can't remember. And I helped out with some other packaging as well. But, we worked for 13 months on building the photography style, setting the standard for that. A lot of really getting into the details. And Steve was very detail oriented, which was great, around what's the right density of the shadows or the reflections of the product in the photograph, or what's the right angle to choose for the product. He was very, very detail oriented for a CEO. And, very in the weeds, also very inspirational. He would hop on when we would meet and we would talk about work, but then he would hop on a browser and surf around and just talk about things that he liked as well. So it was kind of like an Apple keynote meeting with him every time, where he'd try to teach us things about design or architecture.
That's wonderful, Joe. Thank you so much for sharing all these wonderful insights. So what are your tips to the beginners on how to start into design? Well,
I think that, it's you have to be a very good student now. I was not a great student, so I got lucky. And I think you have to work really hard to get into a good design school now. Just the criteria is so much more competitive now than it was back then. I think in general, universities are more competitive in general, not just design. But I think it helps to have a love for research. I think design now involves understanding consumers, understanding people and what their motivations are, what their lives are like. I remember working for Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati for a few years. And I was the creative director of Crest, which is a toothpaste, all around the world, I'm sure, as you know. And so I spent time doing focus groups all over the country, helping, understand why people pick up certain packages versus others, visiting families in their homes in Cincinnati to understand what do they really value about a new product line that P&G was thinking about launching, or, why that product is important for their lives. So there's a bit of a psychological research aspect that comes into play with design, especially now, when you think about the web and you're designing software or apps, you're trying to drive engagement and you're trying to create a user experience that's effective. It's really about psychology and how do you create an experience that gets them to what they really want to get out of the experience as quickly as possible. I think from a brand perspective, we often talk about that we design the signals that companies want to send out to the world and their target audiences, whether that's the media, crafting a message that is important to the media, or whether that's creating an experience for people and customers. It's all about what does that customer, what does our client want to create in terms of a messaging platform and a brand position. And then we design signals to send out to the world and those signals take the form of images or identities or digital experiences. But it's really about, we spend a lot of time trying to understand how to create that communication between a brand and its target audiences. That's really what my job boils down to.
Thank you so much, Joe. So let's begin our episode with typography. So what exactly is typography and why is it important?
That's a great question. Typography has two sides of it, and I'm very passionate about typography. I think, I'm a bit of a nerd, and I grew up as a bit of a nerd, and I love detailed things. And I love picking apart puzzles. I played Dungeons and Dragons a lot growing up. Did you play it all growing up, Tej?
We never had.
No, you didn't have it, but maybe had board games. Or
yes.
Video games. Maybe. So I loved the puzzle aspect of that, of solving puzzles and adventures. And I think typography or typeface design is the same thing for me, as trying to understand a culture and the history is important to design a typeface that's in a different alphabet. And so of course, we speak English just like you, and our alphabet is called Latin because it was designed by the Roman Empire and they spoke Latin. But, even though we speak English, the alphabet is actually Latin. And so I recently designed or creative directed a Devanagari alphabet font, which you might speak Hindi, right? And so the alphabet is called Devanagari. And so I took time to research Devanagari and what it looks like and why does it have the horizontal line across the top that all the letters hang down from. And so that was really a lot of fun, as the research aspect is very important to typography and typeface design. I worked with an Arabic type designer recently as well to understand the nuances of, why the position of certain forms means what it does. Latin is 26 letter forms in caps and then lowercase. And other alphabets come in hundreds, if not thousands, of different letter forms. So it's important to understand the culture that you're designing for. And I guess that's really true of any design project. If you're designing a household product for a family, you have to understand what motivates families. And it's very similar with the typeface as well. You have to understand the culture you're designing for. So there's typeface design, and then there's typesetting, which is typography, which is really the art of layout, the art of legibility, clear content hierarchy. So I think those coming together is really where I like to live as designer.
Thank you so much, Joe. And coming to the second question, which has been most of the times confused by a lot of people, which is what's the difference between a typeface and a font, and how to choose a perfect typeface from millions of available choices?
It's funny. It's not. There's no agreed upon definition between the two. I always tell people that typefaces are what designers call typefaces, and fonts are what your mom calls a typeface. Right, because Microsoft and Google call them fonts, and so and we eventually type designers are going to give up and just call ourselves font designers, because that's what the whole world is going to call them eventually. But I think there's a bit of a technical side to fonts that they're more about the family and the binary. Engineers behind typefaces will refer to them as fonts, and typefaces to me have their root in lead type and Gutenberg and all that good stuff, because typing was a verb, of course, so it's, I think there are two sides of the same coin from a terminology perspective to me.
So how to choose a perfect typeface from the all available choices for any given project?
Well, for me, it's all about psychology and what signal do you want to send for your project. If you want something that feels trusted and friendly, I think that's why a lot of tech brands are using geometric sans serifs, because they have a combination of being crafted and trustworthy, but then they feel friendly because they're based on circles, right? And so I think it's important to understand the psychology of the signal you're trying to send for your client. Now, if you're designing something for a lifestyle brand, maybe you want something a little bit more of like a serif, something that's a little more passionate and emotional, a little more personal and intimate. So I think it's about the qualities and the personality attributes first, and then you try to find typefaces that match those. I think that helps it narrow it down too, Tej, because there are millions of faces out there, and they're in Google Fonts, and they're in Adobe Typekit, and they're on fonts.com, and they come with the operating systems now. So it's really hard to choose the right one. And I think that's why you have to go back to the personality attributes you're trying to identify, and that helps you narrow the list down.
Thank you so much, George. Second question is also somewhat related to this, which is what are the best practices for choosing and pairing of font? If you could share some examples of your favorite font pair.
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I really enjoy combining serifs and sans together. I think that I'm a big believer in dance partners in design, or I guess some designers might refer to as wine pairings. And I like to have a little contrast in the design system of maybe a sans as a display font that gives you a nice modern feeling, and then a serif that is very legible at text sizes. Now that's only recently come back. That used to be the way to do it back before digital, because we had magazines and books. Now, for a long time, I would say a good 20 years, there's a bit of the dark ages where we had low resolution screens that dictated sans serifs to be used more because they were more legible, especially on mobile when we had, I would say, less than 200 PPI screens. Now it's actually really hard to find a phone that has less than 300 PPI. I mean, I've done the research, even in rural India, you can get a very good, very affordable phone at a very high resolution. That wasn't necessarily the case 5-7 years ago, but now Retina class resolution is the dominant resolution everywhere around the world. Even in rural Africa, Central Asia, you can find high resolution screens. So what that means from a design perspective is we can start using serifs again, because we've got resolution that it at least meets, if not exceeds, print. Print was 300 DPI or LPI, which is roughly equivalent to 300 PPI in the world of digital displays. So what that means is we can be more creative again, and we can have serifs again. We can have scripts. And I think that's why you're seeing a renaissance of type design, because you can have calligraphy again. You can have handwriting fonts that are very legible on mobile or on a smartwatch because the screens are so high resolution. So I really think the creativity as a graphic designer in terms of typefaces, selections is wonderful now because you've got so many choices. So I really like to do interesting combinations of serifs and sans. I really like some of the German revivals from the 60s. I like Renner was one of my favorites type designers. He designed Futura. He also designed a typeface called Plaque that was re-released by Monotype a couple of years ago, and it's beautiful. It's got really interesting quirks and details, like the lowercase r has a circle for the terminal, which is a known Renner thing to do. I also really love, some of the revivals that Monotype has done, especially Helvetica was really strong. And I think there's some really beautiful serifs, out there, like Domain is really beautiful. I'm often trying to pitch that to my clients, so I really am obsessed with serifs again these days, and typefaces that have Easter eggs in them, those little details that you enjoy when you make something larger. I really enjoy finding typefaces with Easter eggs.
Thank you so much, Joe. So how do we craft typography for accessibility and inclusiveness? That's
a great question. So there have been some interesting efforts around creating typefaces for dyslexia, for example. One of my friends, Brad Scott, created a typeface specifically for dyslexia. And I think the key to that, and I advised on it a little bit, was that specifically for dyslexia, I know that's not all of accessibility, but it's one small slice. You have to make sure there's a lot of each individual letter form is as legible and as different from the other letter form as possible. So for example, in Latin, the lowercase L is just a bar, typically, right? So like if you look at Futura, it's just a bar. And if you, and in some typefaces also have a 1 can be a bar, right? And that's very confusing to people, and not just for accessibility. And they might be not native English speakers, or they may not be used to Latin. They may be learning it for the first time, and they might be like, "Oh my, why are these designed the same? Like, who thought of this? That doesn't make any sense, right?" That just is not a good design approach to do two different letter forms. One's mathematical and the other one's a consonant, and design them exactly the same. That doesn't make any sense. So, I think it's important to really look at them as an outsider and say, well, how do we differentiate? So, for example, on an L, you can introduce a little hook that goes to the right. that's more of an archaic form, but we can bring it back. It's almost something from black letter, which was a very old form of Latin in Germany and England. We use it in the United States as well, but it's more calligraphic. And so you can revive some of those forms to differentiate the letters more. The other aspect you want to do is when designing for accessibility is you want to introduce as much negative or white space into the letter form as possible. So what do I mean by that? So white space is what defines the legibility of the letter form. So if you think about an N, a lowercase n, or an O, the white space is what makes them different. So the N has a white space coming up into it. An O has a big white hole in it. You have to separate those out and make them as pronounced as possible. So the legibility of a letter actually comes from what's not there and versus the darkness of it, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much, Joe. So any word of advice for young designers to start their typography journey and how to build an attractive portfolio?
In terms of typeface design, Tej, or? Yeah. I think what's great now is the tools are so easy compared to what they used to be. I used to work in Fontographer and Font Lab, and those are much more, complicated apps. They're more for professionals, quote unquote engineers. Now you have glyphs, which I love. I think glyphs is powerful, but it hides the power behind a very simple interface. And you can access the power if you want, but it also can be very simple. So glyphs by itself has created a whole new generation of typeface designers all around the world because it's so simple to use and a relatively affordable app as well. You can copy and paste directly from Illustrator, or you can design in glyphs. Its export function is very easy, and so I think that the tools are relatively easy to work with. Now, you have a learning curve and you have to get good advice, but you can go to Glyphs forums and they have got great tutorials of how to use the app. I think, if you know how to code HTML, which I know a lot of young designers do, working in Glyphs is pretty straightforward. So the tools are great. I think also, I think there are some newsletters you can subscribe to that as a type designer are very useful. I can follow up. I get a couple of newsletters that that are font guides and they send the latest news. I enjoy going to fonts.com or Monotype's site to look at the latest and greatest on font developments. So I think there's keeping up with all the best fonts is interesting. Also on Instagram, it's a great resource. You can follow hashtags like type design or, and then you can kind of see the latest and greatest. 36 Days of Type is a great resource as well. You can follow them on Instagram to see, just get a sense of all the great type designers working around the world. So there's many great ways from social media to the tools being easy to, getting newsletters to kind of get a sense of what's happening out there.
Thank you so much, Joe. So could you please share with us, how does your typical day look like and any interesting stories?
Sure. Well, I don't know if it's interesting anymore with COVID, but we typically get up and get our kids ready for school. We've got an 18-year-old about to go to college and a 12-year-old in 6th grade. So we get them up, get them going, get them working on their homework. And then we usually, my wife and I will spend about an hour on email, just catching up with our clients or touching base with each other on our work. And then we'll take a walk with our kids and our dog just to get some exercise. And then I'll probably work for a couple of hours. Usually it just depends. I might be designing an identity or sending feedback to some of our designers that work for us. We usually have about 8 to 12 designers working for us at any one time. So I have to touch base with the team. And we work with people all over the world, Switzerland, England. We've been working with people, type designers in India. I was consulting last year with a really talented designer in Nigeria, helping me with an African font. I was also meeting with a team out of Taiwan that was helping us with a Chinese font. So I'm usually meeting with people all over the world throughout the day. Which is great. I love that part of my job. It's super fun to learn about different cultures and work with other professionals. It's really one of the favorite parts of my job. So there's communicating, and then I usually work through lunch so I can get a bit of a run in or a bike ride in every day. That's important to manage your stress and stay in shape. And then I'll probably work till 6 or 7 at night. and then try to spend the evening eating dinner with the family every night. That's important to us. We try to have a good balance of not trying to work all the time so we can stay fresh and sharp and not burn out. So that's important for us.
Thank you so much, Joe. So we'll conclude the show by you recommending 3 favorite books of yours and also 3 people who inspire you the most in this space.
Wow. 3 favorite books. I'm a pretty avid reader. That's hard to narrow down. Gosh. Well, let me start with the design book. I really like Michael Beirut's book, How To. It's a great book. I think he's coming out with a new edition, by the way. I think he just posted about that. It's called How To, and he writes about case studies that he's done over the years at Pentagram, and I think a little bit of Vignelli. And he breaks it down on what the lessons were behind the work, which I think is really powerful. So it's not just about the beauty of the work or the end result, it's about how he got there in the process, which I think is really powerful for designers to see the process. I'm also reading the letters of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson right now because I love history. So that not necessarily about design, but I think it's important for designers to branch out and just be students of life. So for me, the history is important, and I enjoy reading about it. I also just read Martian Chronicles again, which is a wonderful science fiction book from the 1950s, but it's beautifully written. I'm a big sci-fi person, and I do like to read trash sci-fi, but I also like well-written sci-fi too. So it's okay. Both are okay. But I can't recommend Martian Chronicles enough because it's just beautifully written. So I would say those are my 3 books to recommend. 3 people. Okay. So 3 people that inspire me, or 3. Gosh, I guess there's so many people that inspire me. First of all, I couldn't do what I do without my wife. She tells me when I'm being boneheaded or making the wrong decision. She's just she keeps me honest, Tej, and I think that's important to have somebody in your life like that, whether it's a partner or a friend or, an advisor or mentor. So she's really important to my kind of personal success. My good friend, Craig Black, he's been a good friend to get to know. He's a typographer and a muralist out of Scotland. And he really always approaches things from a perspective of joy and creativity, which is a good reminder for me because sometimes I get too logical about things. And then, although I've never necessarily known any of the Bauhaus designers because they passed away, they're a previous generation. I really admire the work of Jan Tschichold, who was a German designer and a member of the Bauhaus. And what was inspiring about him was that he was doing experimental typography in the 1930s in Nazi Germany. And he was actually jailed for subversive art because of his typography, which is in a way laughable. Like, why would you get jailed for typography and layouts? But, they were trying to stamp out anything that they perceived as leftist and subversive. And so he was jailed for a short time before he left the country. And, I think he's just a hero of mine because of his craft and everything he designed, but also because, he stood up for what he believed in. So those are my kind of 3 influences in my life.
Thank you so much, Joe, for sharing all these wonderful insights with us. We are looking forward to host you again in our upcoming episodes.
I'd love to, Tej, and I really enjoyed it. So I hope your audience does too.